creating a hierarchy between the other and the subject or the self that is always already identical to itself. Yet again, by way of some inversion or perversion of the postmodernist vocabulary, the old reason of the hegemonic self re-emerges together with the logic of hierarchy which is immanent to it. The normative subject, which is in a ceaseless state of auto-correcting its tendency towards hegemony, so this would be the politically correct European subject. It's the normative subject which is constantly auto-correcting itself in its tendency towards hegemony, as if the entitlement to hegemony is there, but it's okay if it corrects its hegemonic impulses. So the normative subject, which is in a ceaseless state of auto-correcting its tendency towards hegemony, that is to say, the subject of hegemonic guilt, by way of adopting consciousness about the need of affirming otherness, is but a different name for the old universalism, observed by a colonial subject determined by race, class, and gender. So instead of the old universalistic subject, we have the normative subject, which is aware of the different and the other, and keeps affirming the different and the other, but still it retains the position of hegemony. So once again, actually, we're seeing the old type of universalistic subject, which is determined by race, class, gender, and its colonial history. I will claim that the politics of affirming difference are inherently hierarchical, and that there is intrinsic impossibility for any attempt to rethink the binary in a way that will be symmetrical, rendering the two components equal. The grave epistemological deficiency of the notion of the other, consisting in its relational constitution, unlike the self, which is always already identical to itself, and the recourse to the other serves only to consolidate itself, shall inevitably represent an ideological, perhaps also ontological, origin of its unavoidable subjugation. The fact that epistemologically the other is conditioned, is constituted as a relational concept, is the source of problems which will become political, ontological, etc., but most importantly, political. Therefore, I will argue that we are in a need of a new form of universalism, which will be emancipating, one that can be claimed also by the others, or by the subjugated. This should be a new, radically reconceptualized universalism, or rather one that has been invented anew. Such universalism can be purely categorical or formal. This is what is actually the guarantee that it will not be totalitarian or subjugating or universalistic in the old style if it is not reified. If it is not incarnated by anybody, like, by Europe, for example, this is something which is openly argued by Slavoj Žižek, that, this universalistic discourse should be occupied by Europe. So the universalism he has been invoking as a categorical necessity, which is something I concur with him, has somehow become reified as Europe. In his case, I insist that it is important to keep this universalism purely categorical in order to avoid the old type of universalism. So, such universalism can be but purely categorical or formal. This is not, or rather it should not be, so I'm saying it in the next sentence. Thus, it is not, or rather it should not be culturally reified. It should neither be Eurocentric nor European. The presuppositions of the universalism claimed by the oppressed, speaking from a Balkan perspective or from a Western Balkan perspective, which is how they have termed us, Macedonia and what other countries? A couple of other Balkan countries.
Albania, Crna Gora.
Yeah, Albania, Montenegro. I cannot remember that because this is something new, relatively new, and something which, as a term, as a label, comes from outside, and we do not really understand how come. Actually, this is not Western geographically; it's Western, like politically, or in terms of progress, I suppose, how close you are to the European Union. So. Speaking from a Balkan perspective or from a Western Balkan perspective, the normative subject, the one who is never the other, but rather the subject which is always already identical to itself, is of course the European, the one in relation to which the Balkan subject assumes its position of the other. Now I'm going to talk about this malaise, a really difficult to sustain position of being the other. It's conceptually difficult to maintain, sustain, incarnate this position, and by the unease, the deep discomfort it brings, and the asymmetry, it's also a position of being subjugated to a form of violence. This violence is discursive, this violence is purely talk, discourse. And even though this discourse is benevolent, I mean, it's affirming your otherness, it's affirming of your difference, etc. Actually, it's bringing in a certain form of violence because it puts you in this impossible position of being the other constantly. So, the Balkan otherness is affirmed by the liberal and the politically correct normative gaze of the West. However, it is unimaginable that the Balkan subject favorably affirms the Western. It is as if, it's discursively impossible for us to affirm the otherness of the West. So how come that implies that the West is not the other? It's always already identical to itself, or the category of the same. And this is the normative subject. However, it is unimaginable that the Balkan subject favorably affirms the Western, or the cultural paradigm it represents as different and other to itself. So affirming it as different and other to itself. The hierarchical asymmetry is evident, and it is due to the fact that the one who affirms represents the norm, which unavoidably aspires to universal status. The affirmed one is therefore the particular one. So the normative subject is aspires to universal status. The affirmed one is inevitably the particular one. The phantasmatic and discursive impossibility of being the subject that can reciprocally affirm the other to itself, as Balkan subjects, we cannot reciprocally affirm the other, that is the West, is fundamentally, in a way, ontologically subjugating, since it implies a subject position, that of the other, which is never a subject position in the proper sense of the word. It is not grounded in the necessary minimum of sovereignty that is the possibility itself of any subjectivity. This Balkan subject is founded as the proxy subjectivity of the Western European normative self. Moreover, the subject that has agreed to its grounding otherness is constrained to always already assume the perspective of the competent subject that affirms it. So this is the difficult part. So you're always already the other, but you're still supposed to constantly be aware of the perspective of the affirming normative self. One inevitably assumes the perspective for which one is declared to be a priori incompetent. This renders the position of otherness awkward, ill at ease, and the image of it grotesque. Clearly, one is incompetent vis-à-vis any perspective which is not one's own. What is expected of the Balkan subject is to assume the perspective, presuppose and behave as if it belongs to it, of the competent self, and its gaze directed precisely toward itself, toward the other. This is what I mean by this. As this Balkan other, who is always aware of its otherness, you have to have the knowledge of the competence of the normative subject, which renders you other, because you have to imagine in which ways you are other, the other, or different, and try to conform with the normative subject. So you are supposed to have both competences of being the other and presupposing, understanding the perspective of the normative subject. This is why the position is difficult, and this difficulty, it's being hard to bear, is in a way a form of violence. Just being the other is being subjected to violence. And I assume this immediately resonates with certain gendered, also queer experiences or positions. This circular gaze, refracted through the instance of the supposed and imagined proper subjectivity, one that the other would declare as universal or paradigmatic and attempt to mine, represents a self-mirroring which is inherently debilitating because of its tendency to auto-produce itself as the other rather than a subject. What should be a process of the subject's self-constitution, which is by definition an alienating process, it is by definition always, even for the normative subject, it is the becoming subject is a form of alienation, ends as a double alienation, a duplication of the subjectivity into the impossible status of a self and the other. This circular trajectory is one of the vicious circle. While inhabiting the subject position of the other, one also attempts to occupy the position of that sameness which has constituted you as the other, and see oneself as the other, from a subject position which is not one's own. This constitutive division within the subject named the other, so I would call it this subject named the other, does not belong to the order of the split subject as a formal or in the Lacanian sense, as a formal or as a metaphysical category. It is not the one produced by the binaries of metaphysical categories such as the symbolic and the real, or the mind and the body. Rather, it is the result of the symbolic subjugation of one collective self by another. So it is not purely formal, it is not metaphysical, it is not Lacanian, it is purely political. It is a subjugation belonging to the register of the social. It is a political subjectivation, which operates on the level of an identitary constitution. This situation represents a form of violence, a production of trauma, since the political thrust works as an ontological destabilization, quite similar to the phenomenological malaise generated by